Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Tamara Von Hale. I was 34 years old when my husband kissed me goodbye on Valentine's Day and told me he had to leave Dallas for a last-minute business meeting in Austin. He kissed the top of my head like it was a habit he had not bothered to think about in years, picked up his travel bag, and walked out our front door with the easy confidence of a man who expected the world to keep arranging itself around him. I almost let it go. I almost let the florist receipt in his jacket pocket mean nothing. I almost told myself I was tired, suspicious, overworked, and seeing patterns where there were none. Instead, hours later, I stood in a hotel room in Austin with a duplicate key the front desk had issued after checking my identification, the reservation card, and my last name against his. I opened the door to red rose petals arranged into a heart on the bed, a half-dressed woman beside my husband, and a bottle of champagne that had once been mine. I did not scream. I did not ask a single question. I looked at everything for one long, freezing second, set the key card on the dresser, and walked back out. Somewhere between that hotel and the dark highway home, I made a decision that ended everything he thought he still controlled. The thing about numbers is that they do not care who is lying to you. A ledger does not soften the truth because you are tired. A balance sheet does not look away because you have children upstairs, laundry half folded on the couch, and a husband who smiles well in public. Numbers simply sit there and wait for somebody serious enough to read them properly. That had always been my gift. It was 6 minutes past 6 that morning, and I was at the kitchen table in the dark with my laptop open, my coffee cooling beside me, and the fourth quarter projections for Hale Development Group spread across the screen in clean columns I had built myself. I had spent 12 years building those systems, 12 years turning instinct into structure, chaos into pattern, and promises into numbers that could survive scrutiny. The company carried Calvin's last name. It had always bothered other people more than it bothered me. On paper, he was the charismatic face, the man who shook hands at ribbon cuttings and spoke well in a room. In reality, I had built the financing architecture that kept everything standing. I knew every lender, every variance, every delayed payment, every opportunity hidden inside a paragraph most people would skim. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running, which told me Calvin was up early too. That day mattered to him. We were breaking ground on the Caldwell Street mixed-use project, a development that had taken 3 years, 2 investor groups, 1 city grant, and more political patience than either of us liked admitting. I had assembled the financing package myself. I had negotiated the municipal piece, the debt terms, the contingency buffers, and the structure that made the thing possible. Calvin would be the one at the podium. That was how our marriage and our business had drifted into a pattern I told myself no longer bothered me. He came downstairs at 7:15 wearing the charcoal coat that photographed well, his tie already straight, his expression already prepared for the day ahead. He reached past me for his travel mug and asked if Councilman Turner had received the revised site map. I told him the answer to the parking variance question was on page 4 of the memo I had sent. He nodded like that information had simply appeared in his life the way useful things always seem to. Then, while I was still looking at my screen, he said in a casual voice that landed harder because it was casual, that I used to make more of Valentine's Day. I used to dress up. I used to try. I did not answer right away. I looked down at the oversized university sweatshirt I had thrown on before dawn, the leggings I had worn too many days in a row, the clip holding up my hair, and I felt the sting exactly where he meant it to land. Then the front door closed, and there was no time to stay hurt because my 7-year-old daughter, Malia, came downstairs dragging her backpack and asking where her library book was. And my son Micah followed with his shoes on the wrong feet and half a blanket still looped around his arm. By 8 o'clock the house had swallowed the moment the way mornings always do. I packed lunches, found a permission slip, corrected footwear, kissed foreheads, and got everybody out the door. I told myself I had not been thinking about what Calvin said. I told myself that when he called at 4:30, while I was elbow-deep in a vendor reconciliation, I was calm because there was nothing to be upset about. His voice was smooth, almost polished. He said a client in Austin wanted a face-to-face meeting before a Riverside contract went to signature, and he needed to drive down that night. He said he would be back Friday. When I reminded him that it was Valentine's Day, he let out a small breath. And then he said the cruelest lie of the whole week in a tone so weary and reasonable it nearly made me believe I was the problem. He said he knew the date, but lately every conversation with me felt like another obligation he had to manage. He said he did not need guilt from me on top of work. He said I used to understand sacrifice before I got so suspicious and tired all the time. Then, before I could even form a clean response, he added that he needed a wife who trusted him, not someone who turned a work trip into proof that our marriage was failing. The line sat in my chest like a blade. I asked for the client's name anyway. He said Marston Equity and moved past it so quickly I almost missed the hesitation. Then he started talking about traffic, weather, and the drive, and by the end of the call I felt smaller than I had before he rang. That was part of Calvin's talent. He could wound you and leave you apologizing for bleeding. I finished the reconciliation. I made dinner. I helped Malia with her reading and sat with Micah until he fell asleep with one fist curled against the edge of his blanket. Then I came back downstairs, lifted Calvin's other jacket from the kitchen chair to hang it up, and felt a folded receipt in the outer pocket. It was from a florist in Dallas, dated the day before. 24 red roses, arranged delivery, $187. I stood there in the kitchen reading it twice while the refrigerator hummed behind me and the house above me stayed still. I folded it back exactly the way I had found it and sat down. I did not start crying then. I did not make a scene to an empty room. I just sat there and let the facts line up in front of me one by one. Within 10 minutes, I had called my sister Tanya and asked if she could keep the kids overnight. She said yes before I finished the sentence. Tanya was like that. She did not ask for a reason when my voice already contained one. By 5 o'clock both children had overnight bags. Malia was bargaining for popcorn with extra butter, and Micah was sleepy enough to wrap himself around my leg at the door. I held him a second too long, kissed both of them, and got back in my car before my face could turn into something my children would remember. I almost merged straight onto the highway. Instead, I took the next exit and stopped at a department store because some weak, bruised part of me still wanted to believe there might be a version of that night that ended in repair instead of ruin. I bought a burgundy set of lingerie, so simple it almost looked practical. I nearly put it back twice. I did not. Then I got onto the interstate and drove 3 hours south toward Austin with the radio off and both hands tight on the steering wheel. I told myself maybe the receipt belonged to a client gift. I told myself maybe he had planned something clumsy and overcompensating. I told myself maybe distance, exhaustion, parenting, and 12 years of business had simply worn us thin, and I was on my way to remind him that I was still there. The hope I felt was not glamorous. It was tired and humiliating and real. I stopped for gas outside Waco and checked my phone. No message from Calvin. I had not told him I was coming. Part of me still believed surprises belonged to us. They had once, before our marriage became a machine that ran on calendars and quiet resentments. When I pulled into the hotel garage a little after 10, I sat in my car for a full minute before going inside. The hotel lobby was all warm stone and amber light and expensive calm. I had been there once before with Calvin at a conference. I knew the floor, the elevators, the kind of smile the staff wore. I also knew the room number because I had seen the confirmation email flash across his screen earlier that week before he closed the laptop. Room 412. I went to the front desk and told the clerk that my husband had already checked in, that I had arrived later than planned, and that he was upstairs waiting for me. I showed my identification, our shared last name, and the card tied to the reservation. The clerk glanced at the screen, verified the booking, and printed a duplicate key. It took less than a minute. That ordinary little administrative grace is still one of the strangest parts of the whole night. The hallway on the 4th floor was silent, thick-carpeted, softly lit. My heart was moving too fast. I remember smoothing my coat before I slid the card into the lock. The first thing I registered when I opened the door was the champagne bottle on the nightstand. It was the same label as the bottle I had tucked into the back of our wine refrigerator after my birthday, saving it for something special. Then I saw the petals, deliberate and careful, arranged into a heart on the bed. Then I saw Calvin. Then I saw the woman beside him in a silk robe that did not belong to the hotel, younger than me, dark-haired, startled but not ashamed enough. Calvin did not leap up. He did not panic. He looked annoyed, as though I had interrupted a meeting he had every right to be in. I felt my body go cold from the inside out. For one thin, terrible second, I could not move at all. Then I walked to the dresser, set the key card down with a hand that looked steadier than I felt, turned around, and left without saying a word. The moment I got back into my car, the control I had been wearing split open. I did not wail. I did not pound the steering wheel. I bent over it and made a sound I had never heard from myself before, small and broken and animal. My hands were shaking so hard I could not get the key in the ignition. I sat there until the shaking turned into numbness. Then I called Cedric Boone. I had not spoken to him in months beyond one careful business referral, but he had been our corporate attorney early on, and after the first sentence out of my mouth, he was not a distant professional anymore. He was exactly what I needed. He did not ask what I saw. He asked whether I was sitting down, whether I could drive. Then he told me, in the steady voice of a man already building a wall around my impulse, not to text Calvin, not to call the hotel, not to move any money, not to touch a single file in anger. He said anything I did that night had to survive daylight. When I told him I understood, he said he knew I did and told me anyway. That helped. It reminded me there was still a version of me beneath the shock that could do this correctly. By the time I got home at nearly 3 a.m, I had folded the burgundy bag shut, set it on the closet shelf unopened, and sat on the floor beside my bed with both hands over my mouth until I could breathe like a person again. I did not sleep. I closed my eyes for an hour at most and got back up before dawn because children do not care that your marriage ended in a hotel room 3 hours away. I made lunches. I made oatmeal with brown sugar because that was how Micah liked it. I cut Malia's toast into triangles because at 7 that still mattered. Then I picked them up from Tanya's before school. My sister opened the door and took one look at my face. She did not ask in front of the children. She just touched my shoulder once and let me get them out to the car. That evening Calvin came home with his rolling bag, his polished smile, and a new cologne clinging faintly to his coat. He kissed the top of my head while I stood at the kitchen counter pretending to sort school notices. He asked if there was any pasta left. He talked about Austin Traffic, the hotel bar, a client whose handshake had been too firm, all of it smooth and ordinary and rehearsed. Then, because he could not help taking one more cut, he said he appreciated that I had not blown up his phone the night before. He said that kind of trust was the reason serious marriages lasted. I looked at him across my own kitchen and understood with perfect clarity that I could not afford to confront a man until I knew the full size of what he had done. Cedric met me the next morning in his office downtown. He handed me coffee, sat me down by the window, and laid out the company documents without wasting time on pity. That was one reason I had always respected him. He let facts do their work. Hale Development Group, he reminded me, had been formed by both of us 12 years earlier. Calvin and I each owned 50% equity. The operating agreement required both signatures for any ownership change, equity dilution, or transfer of control. Separate from that, the Treasury resolution we signed at formation gave me sole authority over banking access, audits, financial reporting, and the right to demand a formal review of any disputed expenditure as acting chief financial officer. That did not mean I could wave a hand and take the company. It meant Calvin could not lawfully remove me without my consent, and it meant I had every right to inspect every ledger, contract, and account. When I asked Cedric what I was legally allowed to do before deciding what I wanted to do, he said I was allowed to know the truth. He said if there was a trail, I would find it. I believed him because numbers had never failed me the way a person had. I waited until the office had emptied that night. I watched Calvin's black car leave the garage from my window and then sat still for 10 more minutes just to be certain he was gone. After that, I logged in not as a wife who had walked into a hotel room, but as the chief financial officer of a company she had helped build. It is hard to explain how different those eyes are. Most of the accounts I still handled personally, but 2 years earlier, after Micah was born and my work doubled, I had delegated portions of vendor management and marketing spend to junior staff. Calvin had volunteered to oversee one consulting account himself, which at the time seemed less like a risk than a convenience. I started there. The line item appeared monthly in clean, evenly spaced entries under a harmless description: SV Market Advisory Retainer Services. I had seen it in summary reports for months without digging deeper because that was Calvin's department. I pulled the contract. It was professional looking, 2 pages, neat font, proper letterhead. It named SV Market Advisory as the vendor and Hale Development Group as the client. Monthly retainer, $4,000. Signed at the bottom by Calvin and Vanessa Price. I read her name twice. I had met Vanessa once at a company dinner almost 2 years earlier. Calvin had introduced her as a marketing consultant he was excited to bring in, smart and strategic and highly recommended. She had smiled at me, shaken my hand, and said she had heard so much about me. I remembered thinking she seemed polished. That memory felt filthy inside my head now. I pulled every payment made to SV Market Advisory over the previous 22 months. $4,000 a month was only the floor. There were project fees, research fees, campaign development charges, vendor relations expenses, and 11 larger invoices over $10,000 each. 41 invoices in total. Every one of them had Vanessa's signature. The pattern was patient, controlled, and designed by somebody who understood exactly how to hide theft inside routine. The smaller monthly payments cleared automatically through the delegated vendor system. The larger ones had been broken into irregular intervals, so they looked like legitimate bursts of campaign work, instead of a second life being financed in plain sight. That alone would have been enough to tell me it was deliberate. But the money trail underneath it was worse. It took me 40 minutes to trace the first layer and another hour to verify the rest, because I refused to rush. The payments cleared through the company account into a business account registered under SV Market Advisory. The vendor intake form attached to that account listed a tax identification number and a business address in Uptown Dallas. The address was not an office. It was a luxury apartment building. From there the trail widened. A supplemental company credit card Calvin had requested 18 months earlier for vendor relationship management had been charging furniture stores, a car lease, rent payments routed through a property management portal, restaurant tabs, boutique purchases, and travel. When I laid the account activity beside the vendor payments and the joint account transfers, Calvin had been quietly moving through one of our smaller personal accounts. The number locked into place with the clean finality of an audit conclusion. $342,800. Not a rounded estimate. Not a gut feeling. An exact sum spread across 22 months, routed through fraudulent invoices, disguised reimbursements, a hidden company card, and the kind of internal familiarity that only a man inside the house could have used. My husband had stolen $342,800 from the company we owned together to fund another woman's apartment, car, and life. The other woman had signed every invoice. I photographed everything and backed it up onto the encrypted drive Cedric had set up for me that morning. Then I sat in my office in the blue-gray quiet, looking out over downtown Dallas while traffic moved as though nothing had happened. When I called Cedric from the parking garage, I gave him the total exactly. He repeated it back to me the same way a surgeon repeats the site before the incision. Then he said what I had already begun to understand. This was not just adultery. It was financial fraud against a company I half-owned. It was misuse of corporate funds, breach of fiduciary duty, falsified vendor documentation, and, depending on how much Vanessa knew, possible conspiracy. He asked if I was certain on the amount. I told him I had checked it twice. He said good. Then he told me to come in first thing the next morning because the trail felt older than 22 months, and he trusted my instincts when they came from accounting. I did too. The marketing contract was too neat, too fully formed, too practiced. Men like Calvin did not wake up one day and become careful thieves. They rehearsed themselves into it. Cedric and I spent the next morning pushing back further than the marketing contract, through travel receipts, old corporate card statements, client entertainment charges, hotel folios, and reservation aliases. The pattern did not emerge all at once. It emerged the way rot does when you finally move the furniture and discover how far it spread underneath. 34 months earlier, while I was 7 months pregnant with Micah and trying to run the books from my home office because the commute had become exhausting, Calvin had been charging boutique hotel stays in Houston under a guest name that looked meaningless until it did not. V. Price. A dinner 2 nights before. Flowers billed to a corporate hospitality line I had assumed were for client gifting. A second hotel charge 1 month later. The affair had not started when Vanessa became a vendor. The affair had already been alive, hidden, and carefully fed while I was carrying our son and blaming myself for the distance in my marriage. I remember staring at one receipt so long that the numbers blurred. I remembered that season of pregnancy too clearly. Calvin distracted, me exhausted. Me deciding his restlessness must have been work pressure or fear about the baby, or my own failure to stay emotionally available while I was swollen, sleepless, and trying to keep our business balanced. He had looked me in the face during that time and let me believe the problem was me. I took those pages straight to Tanya's house. My sister made tea I did not drink and sat across from me at her kitchen table while I laid everything out in the only order I trusted, date by date, document by document, fact by fact. She did not interrupt until I got to the Houston receipt. When she read the date and did the math, her whole face changed. She said I had been 7 months pregnant then. I said yes. She asked if I had spent that year thinking something was wrong with me, whether I had sat in that house wondering why my husband felt far away while he was already building a second relationship behind my back. I did not answer because my silence answered for me. Tanya leaned across the table and told me I was still talking like an accountant gathering evidence. She said I needed to stop gathering and start building. There was a difference, she said, between waiting to see and deciding I had already seen enough to end something on my terms. By the time I left her house, the grief was still there, but something underneath it had gone clear. I was done discovering. I was ready to act. The next Tuesday morning gave me the last piece I needed. Calvin had a site visit in Plano, and Warren Pike, his business partner for 11 years, was not due in until noon. I used the empty office to review the 11 invoices above $10,000. For years earlier, after a vendor dispute, I had written a control policy into the company requiring a second internal approval signature on any outside invoice over that amount. When I first found the false invoices, I assumed Calvin had forged the second line or buried blanks deep enough that no one checked. I was wrong. Warren had signed every one of those 11 large invoices across 14 months. His handwriting was neat, practiced, and unhurried. Once I realized that, the concealment method made sickening sense. The smaller monthly payments slipped through delegated accounts payable under a routine vendor bundled junior staff, no longer questioned. The larger invoices were routed as campaign expansion and market strategy intensives, so they landed outside the summary dashboards our external accountant reviewed quarterly. Warren's approval gave them internal legitimacy. Calvin's relationship to the vendor kept everyone else away from the details. It was not sloppy. It was a system. Warren had not merely looked the other way. He had signed his name 11 times to help his friends steal from me. Sunday dinner at Patrice Hale's house arrived with all the old family choreography intact. The good dishes came out. Candles were lit even though there was still light outside. Patrice made a meal that tasted like labor and pretended it had all been effortless. I sat across from Calvin with my face arranged into something warm and easy and passed dishes the way I had done for years. I answered questions about the children. I complimented Patrice's roast. I listened to Calvin talk about timelines and city approvals as if his life were still coherent. Then, after dessert plates landed and the room felt relaxed enough for performance, he covered my hand with his and announced that he had booked us a long weekend in New Orleans. No phones, he said. No office. Just the two of us. His voice was soft, open, convincingly repentant. Patrice was delighted. She looked at me like she wanted to believe her son was choosing his marriage. Calvin looked at me like a man watching a door and trying to figure out whether it was locked. I gave him a smile just wide enough to let him think he still had time. His shoulders dropped a fraction. Watching that small release in him made me understand how sure he had been that he could keep acting until the paperwork was in place to take everything else. I was in Cedric's office by 8 the next morning. This time the documents were already laid out in order. He walked me through them slowly. First, a formal notice disputing the validity of any ownership amendments filed without my signature. Second, an emergency petition seeking a temporary restraining order on disputed business disbursements and a freeze on accounts tied to the fraudulent vendor payments pending forensic audit. Third, a divorce filing. Cedric was careful to explain what each piece actually did. Nothing would become final that morning. I was not magically seizing control. I was preserving the company long enough for the law, the audit, and the documentation to catch up with the truth. Under the existing agreements, I already had sole Treasury authority and the right to halt irregular transfers. The court filing would reinforce that authority and block Calvin from racing the paperwork ahead of me. When I signed, it was not an act of rage. It was an act of maintenance. I was finally protecting the structure I had built instead of assuming everybody else inside it respected the beams. 3 nights later, I attended a downtown networking event at a rooftop bar because appearances still mattered until they did not. I wore black, drank sparkling water, and moved through the room with the professional ease Calvin had always taken for granted in me. He was supposedly at a dinner across town with a council contact. I was near the railing when I heard Vanessa's name. I kept my eyes on the skyline and listened. She was with 2 women from a consulting circle, laughing in that polished way I remembered from the company dinner where I first met her. One of them asked whether it was true she was leaving independent consulting by summer. Vanessa gave a small, pleased pause and said everything was finally moving in the right direction. When the woman pressed, Vanessa lowered her voice just enough to perform intimacy and said she was pregnant, still early, but by summer everything in her life would look different. The congratulations came fast. I stood very still with my glass in my hand and heard more than the words. I heard the timeline. I heard certainty. Calvin had not been fumbling between two lives. He had a plan. He expected to remove me from the company after tax season, step into a new arrangement, and leave me holding whatever fraction of a life he was willing to spare. Cedric called me less than an hour after I texted him 2 words, check filings. He had already started. A separate registered agent had submitted 3 draft amendment packages over the previous 6 weeks. 2 were proposed changes to the operating agreement designed to reclassify management authority and create a path toward diluting my stake through a valuation event. The 3rd was a proposed addendum to shift management functions into a new entity Calvin would control. None of them were effective without my execution, but that almost made them worse. He had counted on getting me to sign something later or on forcing a settlement, so fast I would not understand what I was conceding. He had planned the timing around tax season because he still needed my competence to carry the books cleanly through filing. He intended to use my work one last time and then structure me out of the company I had kept solvent. I remember standing in my study with the phone in my hand, hearing Cedric explain all of this in a level voice while the house sat dark and still around me. Every piece fit. The affair. The money. The fake remorse. The weekend trip. The baby. He had not only betrayed me. He had scheduled me for removal. The next morning Cedric had 3 neat stacks waiting on the conference table. The first contained the restraining action, treasury notices, and service documents. The second contained the audit package, the fraud summary, the invoice trail, and the referral materials naming Calvin and Warren, with Vanessa held aside for the moment pending cooperation. The third was simply a list of people who deserved to hear the truth in the room, where Calvin expected to keep controlling the story. Patrice, Tanya, and Warren's wife, Belinda. Cedric looked at me and asked if I wanted a long war or one decisive day. I thought about the hotel room in Austin. I thought about the way Calvin had told me he needed a wife who trusted him while he was driving to another woman. I thought about Vanessa saying by summer everything would be different. Then I looked at the 3 stacks and told Cedric I wanted one day. He nodded once, as if he had expected that answer from the beginning. We filed that morning. The clerk stamped the documents. Service was prepared. The bank notifications went out. The outside accountant received a formal demand for a forensic review. By the time I walked back onto the courthouse steps, my name was on everything that mattered, and none of it was ambiguous anymore. Calvin had already made the reservation for our make-up dinner. That detail stayed with me because it captured him so perfectly. He had chosen the restaurant, the flowers, the mood, all of it designed to make him look like a husband fighting for his marriage. He had no idea I had changed the guest list. I got there early and asked the host to confirm the table extension I had arranged that morning. 6 seats instead of 2. White tablecloths, low lighting, polished silver, the kind of room where people automatically lower their voices because ugliness seems out of place. Patrice arrived first, elegant as always, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Tanya came straight from work, still carrying the alert exhaustion of someone who had lived the whole week on discipline. Belinda Pike arrived last, clearly confused and clearly nervous, which made me feel guilty for the hurt coming toward her and certain that she still belonged at that table. When Calvin walked in and saw the expanded group, surprise crossed his face for a half-second before training smoothed it away. He kissed his mother on the cheek, nodded to Tanya, offered Belinda a pleasant greeting, and sat down across from me with a smile that did not yet know it had already died. I let him settle. I let him pick up the menu, ask for water, trade 2 minutes of normal conversation with Patrice about a renovation project, and relax into the assumption that whatever this was, he could manage it. Then I opened my bag and placed 3 folders on the table. I said I wanted to talk about the company. His smile stayed where it was, but something in his eyes narrowed. He started to say my name in that soft warning tone husbands use when they want to correct their wives without seeming to. I ignored it. I slid the first printed summary into the center of the table and said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, that it reflected $342,800 in fraudulent payments routed over 22 months through a fabricated consulting arrangement to fund Vanessa Price's apartment, car, credit card, travel, and living expenses. Then I opened the second folder and turned it toward Belinda. I told her those were the 11 approval signatures on the falsified invoices, all belonging to her husband. Then I opened the third and placed it in front of Patrice. I explained that those were the draft operating agreement amendments Calvin had filed through a separate registered agent without my knowledge, attempting to create a path to dilute my ownership and move management control after tax season. I spoke slowly. I did not rush a single number. The room went so quiet I could hear the soft brush of a server's sleeve somewhere behind me. Calvin let out a short laugh that did not sound like amusement so much as impact. He said I was taking documents out of context. He said business arrangements often looked ugly to people who were seeing only pieces. He said Vanessa was a contractor, that Warren had approved strategic spending because that was how growth worked, that proposed amendments were just proposed, and I was being dramatic. I watched the performance run until it hit the edge of the facts and started breaking apart under its own strain. Patrice had not picked up her fork. Belinda was staring at Warren's signature as if the ink itself had become venomous. Tanya was looking at Calvin with the kind of stillness that means rage has become disciplined. I said the invoices described services never performed, that I had the contract templates they were built from, that I had already preserved the payment trail, the vendor address, the card charges, and the related transfer records. Then I said Vanessa's name again. Something in Calvin's face twitched. It was not just fear. It was calculation failing in real time. Patrice asked one question. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at her son and asked whether any of what I had shown them was true. That was the moment he cracked. Not fully, not with a confession worthy of the damage, but visibly enough to satisfy the part of me that had once feared he would glide through exposure the same way he glided through everything else. He reached for his water glass and hit it wrong. It tipped, spilled across the edge of the printed spreadsheet, and ran toward his wrist. He grabbed for napkins too late. His jaw tightened so hard I saw the muscle jump. Then he looked at his mother and said, in a voice no longer steady, that things were more complicated than they looked. Patrice did not blink. She repeated the question. Belinda finally made a sound, a sharp inhale that landed somewhere between disbelief and humiliation. Calvin opened his mouth again, but nothing useful came out. I had thought the most satisfying part would be his silence. It was not. It was the brief, unguarded panic in his eyes when he realized that for once the room was not his anymore. By the time dinner ended, he had not denied Vanessa, the money, or the filings outright. He had only failed to rescue himself from the facts. He did not come home that night. He called twice, then stopped. I slept better than I had in a week. The next morning Patrice called me before 8. There was no softness in her voice, but there was something better than softness. There was clarity. She told me Calvin drew quarterly distributions from a family trust established by his late father, and that she had already spoken to her attorney about suspending those distributions indefinitely while the business fraud and divorce were pending. She said she was not doing it out of maternal anger. She was doing it because theft from a business carrying their family name was theft all the same, and because what she had seen at the table the night before was a man stealing not just from his wife, but from the structure other people had spent years helping him maintain. Then she did something I had not expected. She apologized. She said she had not always treated me with the fairness I deserved, and that she intended to correct that now. When she told me whatever support I needed from her going forward, I had it, I believed her. Warren Pike was formally removed from active partnership duties that same week. Cedric's notice to his attorney cited the 11 approved invoices, breach of fiduciary duty, concealment of fraudulent expenditures, and the audit referral already in motion. Belinda did not call me immediately. She showed up at my office 2 days later, eyes swollen but posture upright, and asked only whether I was certain. I handed her the copies. She read them standing up, then put them back on my desk with hands that were very carefully controlled. She thanked me for inviting her to the dinner instead of letting her hear about it from lawyers or gossip. There is no good version of a truth like that, but there is a less degrading one, and I had at least given her that. By noon, the outside accountant had the complete recovery package. The forensic review began. The bank kept the disputed channels locked. Calvin's calls multiplied. I let every one of them go to voicemail. His messages swung from outrage to pleading to cold instructions not to discuss anything with Vanessa or Warren until he could explain. That, more than anything, told me exactly how exposed he felt. He did not want to repair what he had done. He wanted to get ahead of what other people might say now that he no longer controlled the script. I asked Vanessa to meet me once, privately, and said I would not ask twice. She replied within the hour. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, plain enough to offer no comfort to either of us. I arrived first and chose a corner table facing the door. When she walked in, she was trying hard to look composed. Her coat was pressed. Her hair was neat. Her mouth, however, was set too tightly, and she held her bag strap with both hands like she was bracing herself against movement. She sat down and said she knew why she was there. I told her good, because I intended to be brief. Then I placed a 1-page summary between us. Not everything. Just enough. The vendor totals. The apartment address. The card charges. The exact number. $342,800. The 11 large invoices she had signed. The dates. The Houston hotel receipt from before Micah was born. Vanessa did not pick up the page. She stared at it as if it might begin saying something kinder if she waited. Then she said Calvin had told her the money was legitimate compensation routed through consulting because he was fixing the structure of the company. I looked her in the face and told her that if she believed that, she should have asked why a legitimate consulting contract needed a residential apartment address and a hidden company card. She flinched at that, but she still tried to hold her posture. I told her the outside auditor already had the file naming Calvin and Warren, and that whether her name stayed on the next formal referral depended almost entirely on what she did that day. Vanessa asked what I wanted. I said full cooperation, every message, every invoice explanation, every transfer, and a signed repayment arrangement tied to the funds that had passed through her name. She was silent for a long moment. Then her phone lit up on the table. She glanced down automatically. I caught only the first line of the preview before she tilted it away. Call me immediately. We have a problem. It was from the principal at the consultancy. She had recently been telling people she would soon leave on her own terms. Vanessa swallowed and declined the call. A second later, another notification flashed, this time from Calvin. Do not put anything in writing. Do not talk to anyone until I call you. That text broke her in a way my words had not yet managed to. I watched the color drain from her face. She called him anyway, right there at the table, and I listened to it go to voicemail. When he did not answer the second time either, whatever last piece of certainty she had been holding collapsed. Vanessa asked to use the restroom, but the question came out as a whisper. I said she could. She stood, took one step, then sat back down because she knew if she walked away in that moment she might never be able to walk back with composure. Her eyes filled anyway. She kept blinking as if that alone could save her. Then the story started breaking out of her in fragments. Calvin had told her he and I were functionally over. He told her I cared only about the books and the children and not him. He told her he was restructuring the company because I had become too controlling to work with. He told her the money routed through the consultancy was temporary until he finished moving assets legally. He told her by summer we would be divorced, the company would be cleaner, and they would be living openly. When she said that, she looked down at the paper between us and seemed to hear how ridiculous it sounded when laid beside exact numbers and real signatures. I did not comfort her. I also did not insult her. I simply told her that Calvin had lied to both of us, but only one of us had built the life he was trying to steal. That landed. She nodded once, wiped under her eyes carefully, and said she would cooperate. By the time I left the coffee shop, she was still sitting there with both hands around her phone, no longer looking like a woman waiting for a future. She looked like a woman watching one disappear. Her cooperation mattered. Within 48 hours, Cedric had messages, draft invoices, screenshots, call logs, and a chain of texts from Calvin that laid out his timetable more clearly than anything else we had found. In one message, he told Vanessa he needed me steady through tax season, because nobody else could close the filings correctly. In another, he wrote that once the paperwork shifted, things would get easier and my role would be mostly symbolic until settlement. Reading that line did not hurt me the way the hotel room had. It angered me in a cleaner, more useful way. It was the language of a man who had reduced me to utility. With Vanessa's cooperation, the audit package widened. Her attorney negotiated a structured repayment plan against the funds traceable to her name. Her independent consulting prospects collapsed almost immediately, not because I staged some social revenge campaign, but because industries do what they always do when fraud enters the room. Calls stopped being returned. Opportunities thinned out. The glamour she had been wearing at rooftop events disappeared under the weight of legal exposure, and a pregnancy she now understood Calvin had never intended to protect. By the end of that week, she was no longer part of a secret romantic future. She was Exhibit C in a financial case. Calvin was served on a Thursday morning and reacted exactly as men like him react when consequence finally reaches their front door. First came disbelief, then indignation, then the sudden insistence that everything could still be handled privately if only I would sit down and be reasonable. He sent flowers. I had security remove them from reception unopened. He showed up at my office unannounced. My assistant told him he needed an appointment. For one brief second, standing there in the lobby under the temporary signage and waiting area I had walked past for years, he looked genuinely disoriented. Not furious. Disoriented. He was used to moving through those doors as if they were part of his body. Now he had to sign in. He asked to speak to me. I sent word back that all business communication would go through counsel. He laughed when she told him, but she later said his hand shook slightly while he signed the visitor log. That image stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so small and so exact. Betrayal on his scale had been built in increments. So as consequence, the divorce and business fight took months, not one cinematic afternoon. That mattered to me. I did not want a fantasy victory. I wanted a durable one. Cedric kept reminding me that lawful wins rarely look elegant while they are happening. They look like document requests, hearing dates, asset traces, deposition scheduling, auditor calls, and long afternoons explaining the same set of facts in 6 different formal ways. The temporary restraints held. The audit confirmed the fraud channels. Warren negotiated his exit under pressure, surrendering profit participation he had expected to keep. Calvin fought harder. He tried to argue that the vendor expenses were discretionary business development, that my treasury actions were retaliatory, that the ownership amendments were merely exploratory. The documents killed those arguments one by one. Patrice's trust suspension hurt him more than he admitted. So did the text messages Vanessa turned over. In mediation, faced with the audit findings, the invalid filings, the divorce petition, and the prospect of full discovery, he finally did what he had not done in marriage. He calculated accurately. The settlement restructured our holdings. I retained sole operational control of the company and bought down his authority into a minority economic interest with no management role. Joint assets were split under the divorce terms. Fraud-related recovery was tied to his distributions, asset sales, and future repayment obligations. It was not emotional justice. It was better. It was enforceable. A year later, I was sitting in my office at Vaughn Development Group, reading a 43-page quarterly report under my own name. The sign behind reception had changed months earlier. The old branding had come down in one quiet Saturday installation. I was there when the new brushed steel letters went up. Vaughn Development Group. Clean, restrained, exact. My name. Just mine. The business was stronger than it had been in years. That was not because pain had made me brilliant. It was because removing theft, deceit, and vanity from a structure tends to improve performance. The Meridian contract I had quietly restructured after taking sole operational control finished under budget. Our lending relationships were healthier. Our reporting was cleaner. The air in the office itself felt different, less theatrical, more honest. By then Cedric had stopped knocking before entering my office, which was a small thing, and somehow not a small thing at all. He brought me coffee that morning, glanced at the report, and said he knew I had already read it twice. I told him only twice. He smiled and sat in the chair beside my desk rather than across from it. There was no declaration between us, no dramatic reinvention of my life into a romance, because I had no interest in exchanging one fantasy for another. There was only trust, which after everything felt rarer and more intimate than heat. That evening Malia met me at the door at full speed in sock feet, nearly sliding the last few steps across the hardwood. She was 8 by then, all sharp questions and long limbs and earnest certainty. She held out a small bundle of grocery store daisies wrapped in thin plastic and announced that she had picked them for me herself. One stem was bent. The petals were uneven. The whole thing looked accidental and perfect. I crouched down, took them from her, and asked whether she had technically picked them from the checkout line. She said she had picked which ones, which in her mind was the same thing. I pressed my face into the top of her head for one long second and told her they were perfect. Then I stood at the kitchen counter, arranging those crooked little flowers in a glass of water, while Micah argued with the dog about a toy and dinner simmered on the stove. It struck me then, not as a lesson or revelation, but as a fact that love without performance looks ordinary most of the time. It looks like bent daisies and children yelling down a hallway, and a home that no longer feels like a place where someone is quietly draining the foundation while smiling at the dinner table. Calvin saw the new sign on a Thursday. He had come to collect records from the administrative office related to his minority distributions, the kind of minor errand that now defined his relationship to the company he once assumed would always bear his name. He parked in the same lot he had used for 9 years. He walked toward the entrance the same way he always had. Then he looked up and stopped. Vaughn Development Group. My name mounted in brushed steel exactly where Hale Development Group used to be. He stood on the sidewalk long enough for a woman with a stroller to move around him and for a delivery driver to squeeze a hand truck past his shoulder. Life did not pause for his humiliation. When he finally went inside, reception asked him to sign in and wait. He did. Later, one of the analysts who did not know the whole history told me he had been oddly quiet, that he signed the visitor log, stared at the lobby wall for a second too long, and looked like somebody trying very hard not to show what he had just understood. I knew what he understood. The building still stood. The business still worked. The only thing missing from the picture was the illusion that he had ever been the one holding it together. Vanessa was living in Houston by then, nearly 4 hours away, working for one small client, and paying down what she owed on the schedule her attorney, Cedric, and the auditor had hammered into place. It would take years. I heard that through lawyers, not gossip. I did not need more than that. Her collapse had already happened where it mattered. In that coffee shop where her phone lit up with a man abandoning her and the future he had sold her fell apart in her hands. I never contacted her again. There was nothing left to say. She had made choices. So had I. The difference was that mine were now rebuilding something instead of hiding inside it. The last time I saw Calvin in person, months after the settlement, he stood in a conference room reviewing routine distribution documents he no longer had any power to shape. He looked older. Not broken, not transformed, just reduced to the size of the truth. When the meeting ended, he lingered like he thought there might still be a private version of the world where I would explain him back into importance. I gathered my papers, thanked the junior analyst for the revised schedule, and walked out first. Through the glass behind me, I could see him standing there alone beneath a company name that no longer belonged to him. That was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.